welcome to yet another exciting and inspiring Unlocking Archaeology lecture series. My name is Tatenda, the SADC representative in the Southern African Archaeology Student Council. Today, I am joined by my fellow council members as well as colleagues, Precious, Nitya, and Sebastian. And we are happy to present to you our special guest for today. It's unfortunate that I'm not going to give you his name as yet because I want to keep you in suspense. But one thing or one tip that I can give you about this guest is that he loves diving more than anything else. And in the back of my mind, I have structured him to be an underwater explorer. So before I hand over to Nitya so that she can give us a proper introduction to this special guest, allow me to remind you to please do like and subscribe to this channel. And also please do follow us on our Facebook page, Southern African Archaeology Student Council, for more updates on what we do as the Student Council, as well as more updates on the upcoming activities and events, as well as lecture series. So with having said this, allow me to hand over to Nitya so that she can introduce our special guest to us. Please do stay tuned. Over to you, Nitya.
And that was a lovely introduction. I'd like to introduce Professor Jonathan Sharfman to all of you. Jonathan Sharfman graduated from the University of Cape Town in 1999 with a master's degree in Maritime Archaeology. Following graduation, Jonathan worked on various shipwreck excavation projects, including the wrecks of Grosvenor 1782, Oosterland 1697, and Waddinxveen 1697. In 2003, he joined the South African Heritage Resources Agency, SAHRA, as a field officer on the lottery-funded National Survey of Underwater Heritage. In 2005, Jonathan became the manager of SAHRA's Maritime and Underwater Cultural Heritage Unit and remained in the position until 2013. Jonathan formed the African Center for Heritage Activities, ACHA, in January 2013. ACHA was established as an institution through which heritage could be promoted through capacity building, training, and awareness rising initiatives. ACHA's goals are to utilize heritage as a driver for development and social cohesion. In 2017, Jonathan took up a position as a postdoctoral associate at the New York University, Abu Dhabi, and continues to work with the university developing a research agenda and academic strategy for Africa. Jonathan completed his PhD in Maritime Archaeology at the University of Leiden, Netherlands in 2015. His dissertation dealt with alternative approaches to the identification and management of maritime and underwater cultural heritage in sub-Saharan Africa. Today's presentation by Jonathan focuses on a beginner's guide to maritime archaeology in South Africa. Maritime archaeology has struggled to find traction within the mainstream of archaeology in South Africa. The presentation will examine the status quo of maritime archaeology in South Africa. That was a bit about Professor and his presentation. Now I hand it over to Professor Jonathan for his presentation.
Thank you very much. And I just want to say I love this initiative. I love that you're putting these presentations together for students in archaeology to get an idea of what's going on in the field and more broadly outside of their university interactions. Could I share my screen, please? Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about maritime archaeology and the field in South Africa as it is at the moment. I think there's quite an attraction to the sea. And I think people really are interested, not just in maritime archaeology, but in things that happen around the ocean. So I've called this presentation The Lure of the Sea, this attraction that we all have to those water bodies. And it's a beginner's guide to maritime archaeology. It's a broad overview of what's happening in maritime archaeology in South Africa at the moment. I always want to start these presentations by telling people why I became a maritime archaeologist, and it was to impress a girl. I had this idea of what maritime archaeology was going to be about, and it was about treasure, it was about dangerous diving, it was about sharks, it was about being a pirate, it was about all of these really exciting things, and I thought that would be very impressive to the girl that I was trying to impress at the time. It worked out. She married me eventually. I think in spite of the fact that I was a maritime archaeologist rather than because I was a maritime archaeologist. But I had this idea of what the field was going to be like and what I'd be doing as a maritime archaeologist. And I think it had grown out of what was going on in South Africa, but globally within the field and within shipwreck activities in general. I think what most people know about maritime archaeology, the impression that they have, is that idea of treasure. And that comes out of this treasure hunting narrative that has been devised on the one hand, but promoted on the other by people who have wanted to go out and essentially loot shipwreck sites, to go and find that gold, because that exists there. That is something that you find on shipwreck sites very often. But people found it very difficult to distinguish, I think, between maritime archaeology and treasure hunting. No one really saw what the difference was going to be between these people, like in the image you see here, going out and collecting those objects from the seabed, and what it is that maritime archaeologists were going to do. So they had this idea that was based in treasure hunting. And the reason that treasure hunters got away with that, and the reason that those lines were blurred, was because they were saying that they were doing archaeology. There were so few maritime archaeologists in South Africa that this was really an opportunity for people to bring things up from the ocean bed and show them in museums, show them in documentaries, show them in newspapers, and tell people that they were doing the archaeology. They were doing the job of archaeologists by showing these things to the broader public. There was another narrative that went along with that. As archaeologists, historians, heritage managers started to take more interest in the underwater cultural heritage and started to look at the activities of the treasure hunters, they started to criticize those more and understand that that was not archaeology that they were doing. And the argument against that was that this was not the heritage of South Africa, that these shipwrecks represented foreign powers that were here by accident and that were here through colonial activity. So this was not a heritage that was relevant to South Africa. And again, it was very easy to promote that and to gain public favor and to push down archaeologists and push down what archaeologists were trying to do. So this narrative had developed, and it was something that I had bought into as well. That's what I understood from maritime archaeologists, or as what maritime archaeologists did. And I have to say that this is not something that maritime archaeologists can say that they're free of guilt from. Maritime archaeologists and archaeologists generally, I think, are not good at promoting themselves. And I use this example in all of the presentations that I do. Presented with these two options, would you rather read maritime and underwater cultural heritage in South Africa, the development of relevant management strategies in the historical maritime context of the southern tip of Africa, or would you rather read Treasure Hunt? And I have to say, I would pick up Treasure Hunt every single time, despite the fact that I wrote one of these. Treasure Hunt is much more exciting, and archaeologists don't promote their activities well, despite the fact that they really are exciting. What archaeologists, and I think maritime archaeologists, are doing is really something that the public is interested in. And I think it's something that we should represent much better, and we should represent in the same terms as treasure hunters do. A narrative that's accessible, something that people can really read about and get involved with without having to go to those scientific journals and that dry literature that we tend to produce. We're doing the same activities as treasure hunters. We're working in those environments. We're bringing up those same things. It's just that we're doing archaeology when we're doing those activities. And the archaeology is what makes those things really interesting. A gold coin is a gold coin, but a gold coin with a story is something that I think people want to hear about. And I think as archaeologists, we can tell those stories. And I'll get back to that in a bit. So if maritime archaeology is not treasure hunting, what is it exactly? And the reality is that it's the same as terrestrial archaeology. It's just practiced in a different environment. The tools that we use, the methodologies that we apply are the same as terrestrial archaeologists apply. I always put up a few quotes of people trying to describe what it is. And I think George Bass, who's considered the grandfather of maritime archaeology, really said it best. Archaeology underwater, of course, should simply be called archaeology. Keith McElroy, also one of the early maritime archaeologists and the early forefathers of maritime archaeology, defined it a bit more in a bit more detail, and saying the scientific study through the surviving material culture of all aspects of seafaring, ships, boats, equipment, cargoes, catches, passengers, etc., is what makes up maritime archaeology, or the field of maritime archaeology. The Bluffer's Guide to Archaeology describes it as archaeology, but trying to do it when standing up in a hammock. And I'll get back to that in a second as well. I think that is quite relevant, despite the fact that it's meant as a joke. So there I was, going through maritime archaeology, learning more and more that it was not so much about the treasure hunting, and that it was more about the archaeology itself. But it was still something that was really difficult in the South African context to argue in terms of that thing. It's not your heritage, that these shipwrecks are colonial shipwrecks very often. They're there by accident. They're things that people often don't relate to, and they're things that people will very, very seldom see. Most people will never get an opportunity to dive, let alone dive on an historic shipwreck, an archaeological site that's underwater. So what did those things mean? There was that colonial legacy that was sitting underwater. And although we tried to define maritime archaeology within the South African context and the impact of those ships on South African development and the history of South Africa, it was difficult to get away from that colonial narrative and that very difficult past, something that people, I wouldn't say wanted to ignore, but that's something that people did not feel that they should put time and money into to understand better. And what would these shipwrecks tell us about South Africa? What would we understand about South Africa better doing the archaeology of these shipwrecks? And that was something that played on my mind for a very long time. And it wasn't until quite late after I'd finished my master's and when I was working in the field that it started to dawn on me that it allowed me to better understand what it was that we were really doing. And I worked on an archaeological project called the Slave Wrecks Project, which is a joint project between Iziko Museums, the Smithsonian, George Washington University, and the US National Park Service. And it's a project that looks at slave ships around the world, and slave shipwrecks in particular. Slave ships have not been excavated at all archaeologically before this project started. So there was a whole new narrative that we were trying to explore, and a whole new part of archaeology and underwater archaeology that we're trying to look at. But I was sitting on the bottom of the sea, working on the slave ship, the Sal Jose, off of Clifton in Cape Town, and exploring the objects that we were recovering, and thinking about the slave trade and thinking about slavery in broader terms, and finding it really difficult to relate to, really difficult to understand. For me, the idea of 12 million people being captured and taken across the Atlantic Ocean was just too much to understand. That's too many people. I couldn't see that. I couldn't get my head around that. I understood the tragedy of it, and I understood all of the ideas around slavery, but it was something that was detached from me. But as I picked up these objects, as I picked up concretions that contained shackles, I started to understand that these were individuals. And working on those shipwreck sites that were associated with slavery, I began to come face to face with the people that had been wrecked on those ships, the people that had died on those shipwreck sites. And when that became personal, when it became, those excavations were telling the stories of one person, I started to understand those things better. And I think that's what maritime archaeology is moving towards. It's not trying to tell the grand narratives, those historical narratives. It's starting to tell the stories of individuals. And maritime archaeology does that very well for reasons that that we'll understand in just a moment. So there I was looking at these archaeological sites, and they were telling the stories of people that I related to. They were telling the stories of events and people in the past that were relevant to all of us. It wasn't just us as archaeologists or us from a certain group that had an association with those shipwreck sites and those shipwrecks more generally. But there were still problems with it. There were still problems with maritime archaeology as a discipline in itself. It's a discipline very much rooted in Western concepts of what archaeology is and how archaeology is practiced. And there's nothing wrong with that. It was developed, the field grew out of Western shipwrecks. It grew out of European and Mediterranean shipwrecks. It wasn't considering anything happening in Africa, the Indian Ocean, or anything else. Its birth really was the examination of ships that explored the Mediterranean and traded around the Mediterranean, and later on those European ships that went out and explored the world. So it was a discipline that sometimes didn't resonate, and what we were doing with those shipwrecks didn't always resonate, despite the fact that they were important with people that we're dealing with and people that we wanted to show these stories to in South Africa and Southern Africa more broadly. In doing the National Survey of Underwater Heritage with SAHRA back in 2003, we started to look at sites that were not just shipwreck sites. And we started to explore what maritime archaeology was in the South African context, what it was that we were looking at, that these were not just things that were relevant to shipwrecks. So we started to look at sites that had to do with the ocean and things that were often covered. So it remained within that idea of underwater archaeology. And the first thing that we started to look at was these stone-walled fish traps, which exist along much of the southern coast of Southern Africa. And the way these fish traps work, they go out into the sea. As the tide rises, they're covered. Fish come over them. As the tide settles or recedes, the fish get trapped behind the walls, and they're much easier to catch. And we started to look at when these things were built. And although we had no definitive answers to them, we wanted to map them. And there was evidence, or there was a supposition that they may have been up to 2,000 years old, that current sea levels at which these things operate occurred from 2,000 years to the present. So we had this idea that we could push maritime archaeology much further into the past in the South African context than just the shipwreck sites that existed in the last 500 years or so. We also started to look at other sites that were underwater, and this is an Iron Age site up north in Limpopo, which is submerged because of a lake that was human-made. So the site is not something that was underwater necessarily, but it is still underwater, and was not underwater when it was formed, I should say, but it is underwater now. It is something that exists in that marine environment. And what is interesting, I think, about this is that it illustrates the idea that, and I know this will annoy other archaeologists, but I believe that all archaeology really is maritime archaeology. All archaeology looks at human activities, and all human activities are centered around water. It's something that we need to survive. There is no environment in which humans live that there's no access to water. Even in desert environments where people can stop, the routes that they can take to travel across deserts relies on the fact that they have at some point access to water. So it's not a popular opinion, but I believe that all archaeology really is maritime archaeology. All of human activity is related to their access to water. And that access shows up in the archaeological record. So I think that's important as well. And for the other archaeologists, feel free, of course, to disagree. But there are these other sites that are not just shipwreck sites that we can start to explore. On top of that, in 2009, we started working along with SAHRA on a program called the Maritime Archaeology Development Program. And we started working with Dutch counterparts from the Center for International Heritage Activities. And part of the funding agreement that we had with the Dutch government, who was funding the project, was that we started to look at maritime cultural or maritime and underwater cultural heritage in a bigger context than just the shipwreck sites where maritime archaeologists tend to work. They're focused sites, they're easy to see. And out of that project, taking into account those fish traps, which you see the picture of here on the top, including the shipwrecks, that classical maritime archaeological perspective is not something that should be ignored. But we started to look at other aspects as well. The fish traps, you can see some infrastructure here, an old harbor on Robben Island, and what that means in terms of the development of South Africa as an island, but also as a site that has a long history of or a long relationship from the sea, with the sea. And I won't get into too much detail about that, but there's a very long history that exists with Robben Island. Of course, the prison we all know about, but there's a history that extends much further back. We also started to explore sites that were not so much those tangible archaeological sites. And the image you see here on the bottom left is Lake Fundutsi. And although there's probably archaeological evidence within that lake, it's not something that we can access. For those of you who don't know Lake Fundutsi, it's a sacred site. And it would be unethical of us to go and dive in that lake and recover the objects that are associated with the rituals and traditions that go with that lake. But it is something that we need to look at. That is an important site. And when we're trying to understand the archaeology of the area around the site, we need to understand the role of that lake in that archaeology. So that intangible heritage, the way people perceive that heritage, is important in the archaeological interpretation. So out of this, we've got those underwater sites, we've got those sites along the coast, we've got those inland sites associated with water, and then we've got these landscapes that develop around them. And we started to adapt the idea of the maritime cultural landscape, an idea that in maritime archaeology really only emerged in the early 1990s, and it's a new idea. So we started to look at what those landscapes mean and how those sites fit into that landscape rather than just the sites themselves. Of course, there's a lot of information and a lot of archaeological data we can get for the sites themselves, but how do they all fit together? What happens on land that impacts what happens underwater? What happens in the water that impacts what happens on land? And what kind of traditions, what kind of intangible heritage is associated with both of those? This really came to a head. We did a project in the Eastern Cape along the Wild Coast. It was funded by the South African Heritage Resources Agency. And the original idea of this was to go out to the Wild Coast, to a small area where we had heard that people claimed to be descendants from shipwreck sites. And what we wanted to know was who those people were and what links they had to those shipwrecks. We wanted to add another layer and look more deeply at the impact of those shipwrecks, but through those direct connections. And we went out there and we started to ask questions about that. We started to interview people and ask them about their relationship, their direct relationship with the shipwreck sites that existed there. And we really found nothing. People were reluctant to talk about it. So we came back and started to look at the questions again. We understood that people had a relationship with those shipwrecks, but we didn't understand how. And the questions that we were asking were the wrong questions. And this was a fundamental shift in the way that we started doing maritime archaeology in South Africa, that instead of just looking at the shipwreck sites as individual objects, building them into the landscape became important. We needed to realize that people understood their past differently and they understood the archaeological record differently. I put up a picture here of some blue and white ceramics that were washed up from shipwreck sites on on the wild coast. And although these aren't on the archaeological sites, they have meaning to the people who have picked them up. And the way that people understand what's happening on those shipwreck sites and what those shipwreck sites did and the role that they played in the development of that region is embedded in these objects. And again, I'll get to that in a second. So we started to develop this new approach to the archaeology, or the maritime archaeology, that we were attempting to do. We had that shipwreck evidence and we could analyze that shipwreck evidence, but we wanted to add people into that. And I think it was Mortimer Wheeler, who I think is seen as again, one of the founding fathers of archaeology generally, who said that archaeologists are not digging up things, we're digging up people. And this was something that we had separated from the maritime archaeological research that we were doing. We wanted to understand how ships were built. We wanted to understand how ships operated. And although people were part of that system, they really were just minor players in the bigger processes that were happening aboard the ship. It wasn't about the individuals themselves. It was rather about how those ships operated, how those hierarchies aboard ships operated, and how that impacted long-distance trade, how that impacted on the development of places where those ships ended up. So as we started to include people in this, we developed this, for maritime archaeology, this new approach that we started to ask or change the way we were asking questions. When we went out to those places in the Eastern Cape, instead of saying, this is what we want to know, tell us what you know about that, we started to ask the question, what is it that you want us to know? How do you want us to understand those sites? And how do we interpret those sites in the context of the people that are living around them? What were the impacts of those sites? It's easy to understand what a 200-year-old vessel does. It's easy to understand what a cargo is. But what is the meaning of those things? What does that mean in the bigger context of the development of South Africa? What does that mean in the bigger context of archaeology? So this was a fundamental shift for us. And it was a fundamental shift in the way that maritime archaeology happened. Although this is something that is not unique to South Africa or to Africa, it's unique to the way that we do it. There's often this idea that maritime archaeology is not important because South Africa is not a seafaring nation. And that's true. South Africa traditionally has not been a nation that has built boats and sent them out to engage in long-distance trade. But that doesn't mean that South Africa, and Africa more broadly, is not a maritime continent. South Africa is a maritime nation. For thousands of years, South Africans have been interacting with the ocean for food. There's a lot of mythology, cosmology, and religious practices that relate to the sea, to the water. And the way people view those shipwreck sites and the way people understood those shipwreck sites plays into that and is interlinked with that. So again, that question, what is it that you want us to know? What did that shipwreck mean to you? Or what does that shipwreck mean to you now? Helps us understand the archaeological site better. So that was the shift that we were trying to make. This also meant that we were telling more relevant stories, more meaningful stories. This allowed people to engage with underwater cultural heritage and maritime archaeology in a much more close way and in a deeper way. And we could add many, many more layers to that maritime archaeological narrative that we had. And we could send a much deeper story. We could go much deeper into the past when we started to understand that relationship with the sea, rather than just looking at those sites that we could identify underwater. So this was important. It also, by changing the question, allowed people to tell their own stories in their own way. And this, it doesn't look like much on the screen, but this is the outcome of the project in the Eastern Cape. We started to understand those stories of local practices and local traditions and local cultures in relation to the sea. The people that we worked with put together this exhibition. they took objects or representations of objects that they wanted to talk about, that had meaning about the sea and about water bodies and how people had traditionally used the sea and water. And they put them into these jars. And although you can't see it on this image, each of those jars has a solar light on the top of it. And they were put inside this darkened room. And you could walk around. This is an image that has been stretched, but these were in a circle, and you could walk around the outside of these, and they were glowing jars. They were glowing objects suspended from the ceiling, but you just saw those suspended objects. And as you walked around, they had told the stories of what was going on there, how these objects and how the relationships with the sea worked. And those were playing in the background. And it was for us, a new way of telling the stories. It was a new way of presenting that maritime archaeological evidence that we were trying so desperately to put into the public domain, and to shift that narrative away from treasure hunting into something that was relevant and something that everybody could see was part of the broader South African history and the broader South African context. So what's important here? I think the idea that maritime archaeology is not relevant in the South African context is something that we should put to bed, something that we should move beyond. It really is important, and although it's rooted in those Western methodologies and those Western ideologies and theories, it is something that we can apply. There's nothing wrong with those methodologies. There's nothing wrong with that theory, but we do have an opportunity to develop an African approach to maritime archaeology and a South African approach to maritime archaeology that is unique, that is different, and that takes archaeology as a discipline and makes it into something else, that makes it into something better, and that helps us explain our past, the South African past, in a better way than maritime archaeology has traditionally been able to do. So what is it that we're doing? Well, we continue to work on these kinds of projects. We continue to try to collect those oral histories, those oral traditions. And we continue to work on those shipwreck sites. We continue to work on those maritime related sites, but we're putting that all into the maritime landscape context. We're putting that into the broader perspective. The way that we do this is to put the archaeological sites and the archaeological evidence into maps, and archaeologists map everything, as I'm sure all of you know. So we can start to map those, and we can start to map those in a bigger context, in a bigger landscape. But on top of that, we can start to put in the other layers, those oral history layers, those layers of alternative narratives of the maritime past. And we can start to build deep maps, and we can start to understand the role of maritime culture and the role of the sea and the role of water within African cultures, within African histories. And I think that that's really important. I think that we're building a much deeper understanding through those maps, through those layered multi-perspective maps and those multiple perspectives more broadly. And it starts to give us the opportunity to understand South Africa within a much bigger context. We sit at the southern tip of Africa. We sit between the Atlantic and the Indian Oceans, and we sit within the systems of both of those oceans. The historic and Arabian trade routes in the Indian Ocean, trade from the Middle East, from Asia down the East African coast. The European and West African systems in the Atlantic Ocean, those ideas of slavery which cross both oceans. And there we sit right in the middle of that, with a connecting point between those very ancient and important maritime systems that have developed. And so although we weren't building the boats, we were very much part of those systems. So maritime archaeology in South Africa is critical to our understanding of global history. And it's critical for our understanding of South African history at all layers, from the global, the regional, to the very, very local, which exhibitions like the one that you see on the screen now really illustrate very well. This is a maritime history that may not resonate with everybody. It may not be important to everybody. And it may not be a maritime history that anybody has thought about or heard before. But to the people who live along the coast, that is an essential history. It's an essential part of their identity. And we need to understand that, whoever we are, those different maritime archaeological sites, those different sites underwater, those different relationships that we have with the sea, whether we're somebody who lives on the coast, whether we're somebody who lives inland, whether we access the sea as a diver, whether we access the sea as somebody who collects seafood, whether we're a fisherman, all of those but if there are any questions, please ask them. To finish off, I believe you've had Celso and Cesar talk in the series before about their experiences and the work that they're doing in Mozambique. And they are, as young archaeologists, they are the generation, as are you watching this presentation, who can take what we hope are the beginnings of that new approach, the beginnings of developing an African approach and a relevant approach to maritime archaeology further, to develop that approach and to make it something that we want to do, and that has importance and relevance and significance to Southern Africa and to the people that we're working with. So these are just two pictures and a small video of the work that I've been involved with, but that they are leading in Mozambique. I included these images because they are images with nice clear water that you can see. So going back to me doing maritime archaeology to impress a girl and that idea that I had of maritime archaeology, did it live up to my expectations? Well, absolutely. All of those things, all of those ideas of treasure, all of those things about exploration, all of those ideas of battling sharks and all of that adventure is encapsulated and is part of maritime archaeology. But what I've learned over the last 20 years or so is that there's so much more to it. This is such a vast and important field that is really in its infancy in the Southern African context. So I urge all of you to explore maritime archaeology in more depth. I urge you to get involved in maritime archaeological projects. This is at the cutting edge. It's something that will become more and more important as we deal with issues such as climate change, as sea level change. Maritime archaeology is going to become more and more relevant. And I think that the most important archaeological discoveries of the coming decades are going to be underwater sites. So let me leave it there and open up to any questions that you may have. I will stop sharing.
Thank you, Professor John. That was a very, very insightful presentation. I must say, I didn't blink a lot. That's the best I can describe. So, does anybody have any questions for Professor?
Oh, yes. Thank you, Professor Jonathan. This was a highly insightful presentation, because basically from me, I took a lot of lessons from it. So maybe just a quick one in terms of globalization, how we understand globalization from a maritime perspective. I remember some time in 2019, I was trying to work on a project which was trying to link the Southern Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, trying to reconstruct the maritime, it's the maritime Silk Road, yes. And within the project, I was trying to find some shipwrecks which I might map along the way, so that I might be able to have a clear view of this route. Can you kindly maybe inform us on what has been done so far as far as maybe trying to discover the possible shipwrecks between the Eastern Africa, or rather Africa, or within the Indian Ocean, which links Africa and the Indian part, or rather the Asian part? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a great question. I talked a lot about South Africa being part of those systems, and East Africa being part of those systems. I think it's a difficult question to elaborate on, because so little maritime archaeological work has been done in Southern and Eastern Africa, despite the fact that there are very well, there are wonderful projects happening in Mozambique, in Tanzania, in Kenya, and up into the Arabian Peninsula. Maritime archaeology, unfortunately, is expensive and difficult, much more so than terrestrial archaeology. And that's no excuse. But it's something that again, is in its infancy. So there are shipwrecks that people are starting to explore along the East African coast. But it's early days. Those projects are relatively new. They also tend to be focused on the European shipwrecks. And the European incursion into the Indian Ocean is relatively late in the system. People have been trading down the East African coast and around the Indian Ocean for 4,000, 5,000 years. And Europeans have been around for 500 years. But the ships that we tend to find, the ships that have endured over those 500 years, tend to be the European ships. So that's been the focus of maritime archaeology. The challenge presented by treasure hunting has also forced maritime archaeologists to focus on European shipwrecks, because those are the ones that are under threat. Those are the ones that archaeologists have to try to get to and explore and get the archaeological data from before it's lost to looters and treasure hunters. So that has, I think, is another problem that maritime archaeologists face, that has come out of that treasure hunting idea and that treasure hunting narrative. That maritime archaeology and the maritime history of the Indian Ocean is a European history rather than an African, Asian, Indian Ocean history. I will happily share details with the people working in Mozambique, in Tanzania, and in Kenya with you. I will happily share details of people working in India and Sri Lanka as well. And those are areas that you can explore, but or sites that you can explore. But bear in mind that they are not representative necessarily of that Indian Ocean, that ancient Indian Ocean system. They are focused on the more recent European ships. The underwater environment is a difficult environment in terms of preservation as well. Things can be exceptionally well preserved underwater or not. It can go either way. And those older ships, those ships that are made out of less durable materials, often disappear in the marine environment, and especially up the East African coast where the water is warmer, and up into the Arabian Peninsula, across into India and Sri Lanka. Those warm oceans are conducive to the little animals that eat wood and the things that make ships. So ships have disappeared, or have often disappeared. So they are difficult to locate. They're also made out of different materials, and the tools that we use as maritime archaeologists, things like magnetometers, which identify ferrous metals, iron, underwater, don't work well on those Arabian dhows in the generic sense of what a dhow is, or the reed boats. And you can see behind me some examples of the materials that people were using 4,500 years ago to construct ships. These have no iron in them. They don't get detected by the equipment that we use. So they're very, very difficult to find. So there are examples that relate to that Indian Ocean system, but they tend to be more recent examples, and they tend to be representative of a different Indian Ocean system than the one that was around 1,000 years ago, for example. So we need to be aware of that when we are looking at them. I don't know if that answers your question. I hope it does.
Thank you so much, Prof. I'm well answered. I'm well answered. Maybe just in that regards, what has been done so far? Maybe I think in terms of encouraging the upcoming students, crops of students, to venture into this field. What has been done to ensure that more people gain insights and interest in this field? Because then there is a very interesting point that you've raised, that because it's a lot of people are perceiving it as a European history rather than the Indian or the African history. What can be done to ensure that the upcoming crop of students actually follows through these footsteps? Thank you.
I also
Yes,
add a question
sorry.
before that. I'm so sorry. I also wanted to add to that question, asking, like he said, for a message for the upcoming students, and also a few reading recommendations that could actually maybe give them interest in pursuing marine archaeology.
Yes. I think in terms of promoting maritime archaeology, there's not a lot for people to look at. The SLAVERX project, the project that Ezeco is leading, I think is a really great example. And I think I would encourage everybody to go and look at that project. There's a lot of information online through the Ezeco website and through the Smithsonian website and various other sources. I would also encourage you to speak to people who are working in the field, and that's difficult in South Africa because there are very few maritime archaeologists, but there are ways to get involved. But the beauty, for me, the excitement of maritime archaeology is that it is this young field. It's the field that new archaeologists, emerging archaeologists and academics can really get to grips with and can shape. It's up to the next generation. I was taught within that Western system of what maritime archaeology is. And although I can try and look at those new approaches, the next generation of maritime archaeologists are the generation that will define this field in Africa. So I think it's important that people do get involved. It's difficult, having said that. There's no university in South Africa that offers maritime archaeology as a subject in and of itself, although there are various options to work with within local universities to do projects that have a maritime archaeological focus, potentially getting in external co-supervisors in the case of postgraduate work to complete a master's, an honors, a master's, and beyond. So yes, I think what sources do you look at? Again, something that's difficult to answer. There are sources directly from South Africa that people like me have produced. I would urge you, if you're Googling people, you can look up John Gribble, Jaco Boshoff, Vanessa Maitland, Bruno Wirtz, all people that have worked or are maritime archaeologists and have produced some more academic texts. In East Africa, Celso and Cesar, whose presentations you've seen in the series, Caesar Bitter in Kenya has written quite a lot, looking at the broader Indian Ocean context and Kenya and Mozambique in particular. There is, I think, for South Africa and for South African students, there's no seminal text that I can recommend. There are big archaeological texts, people like George Bass, Keith McElroy, that you can go and look at if you want to understand the evolution of maritime archaeology. You can start to look at institutions like the Nautical Archaeology Nautical Archaeology Society, who run training programs for they're non-academic training programs, but they do introduce people to the basics of maritime archaeology and maritime archaeological methodologies. So there is some information out there, but in terms of that information aimed solely at South Africa or Southern Africa and Africa generally, there's not as much as we would like, and it's difficult for me to recommend anything for people to go and look at. Having said that, feel free to get in touch. I'm happy to discuss it with anybody who's interested and prepared to listen. I'm extremely passionate about maritime archaeology. I think it's such an exciting field. I think there's so much opportunity. So I'm very happy to talk to people who have an interest and would like to develop skills in the maritime archaeological field.
I was just wondering, like you mentioned skills. I mean, people would come in just with a degree. Is there any other skill that we can develop while doing our archaeology degree? If, for example, I'm doing archaeotourism at the moment, but let's say I want to switch to maritime archaeology, then what are the skills that I would require, or what are some of the parameters or requirements that I'd have to meet if I were to apply for another master's in maritime archaeology?
Yes, I'm glad you asked that as well, because that relates back to something I was talking about earlier on, and the idea of what is maritime archaeology. Do you have to become a diver to become a maritime archaeologist? And in my opinion, no, you don't. I think looking at humanity's relationship with water is really maritime archaeology. That's what we're exploring. So the kinds of skills that you would need, as George Bass said, maritime archaeology should really just be called archaeology. The skills are no different. If you're working in the underwater environment, of course, you need to have those diving skills, and the way that you work underwater is determined by the environment. It's not as easy as working on land for obvious reasons. If you do want to work underwater, then you would need to learn how to dive. But as I said, there's so much that we can look at of how we've interacted with the sea for millennia, that you can start to explore those areas from whatever perspective interests you, really, and start to look at that through the same research methodologies that you would apply to terrestrial archaeology.
Okay,
and please encourage your universities to ask people to come and present about maritime archaeology. There's so much for us to tell, and I don't think there's any maritime archaeologist who wouldn't be happy to come and talk to students or talk to anybody about what it is that we are doing.
I have just one other question.
I'm sorry, Sab. I was just saying we'll spread the awareness. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, I have one final question, and well, unless there's others to follow me. I just wanted to ask, I've noticed recently there's a exhibit that's going, like exhibition that's starting at Iziko sometime now in February about hand axes that were discovered in Table Bay. As a student who wants to move more or further into Stone Age archaeology, would you say that there's a greater scope for Stone Age research when it comes to maritime archaeology, or for the moment, at least within the skills that we do have or the tools that we do have, it's pretty much going to be sidelined to studying fish traps on the beach and potentially just recovering some artifacts when studying shipwrecks, for example? I say that because I think the stuff that was found in Table Bay was discovered alongside a shipwreck that was excavated.
Yes, I worked on that site and was around with the discovery of those objects. And the short answer to your question is yes, there is a lot of scope for looking at that deep history and going back tens of thousands of years. Bearing in mind sea level change that has occurred with the last ice age in particular. And I mentioned Robben Island and never came back to it. And the objects that have been recovered, the archaeological work that's been done on the island, that goes back to potentially when Table Bay was dry and Robben Island would have been a hill in the middle of a savanna. So those sites are there. They're now inundated, but those very old sites exist underwater. And there's quite a lot of work going on trying to map the seabed and trying to identify those sites in South Africa and various places around the world. And when I said those exciting archaeological finds of the coming decades will be underwater, it's in that kind of context. Those things must be there. And what we're seeing there is potentially more important than what we see on land. If those sites are contemporary, and if, as we understand it, people interact with the sea in ways that we know people do, it may be that those sites are more representative of the evolution of humanity and human cultures. And the sites that we're seeing that are now on the kind of edges of what those plains would have been are kind of the outliers. And those things that we find underwater are the true reflection of how people were developing and how humans were developing 10,000 years ago or beyond. So those sites are there. They're difficult to find. I'm not saying you just go out and map the seabed and there you're going to find the archaeological sites. And I think those hand axes illustrate that very well. They were within the layers in the shipwreck site, buried under meters of sand, but they are there. The Council for Geoscience is doing this kind of work. If you, I'm sure they'd be happy to talk to you directly. If you go onto their website, there may be information there as well. But they're mapping the sea floor. They're mapping ancient riverbeds. They're mapping those prehistoric, for want of a better word, landscapes that exist there. Not in as much detail as to identify specific archaeological objects, but potentially in enough detail to show us what the landscape looks like. And we could look at those landscapes and try to model where people may have lived and where settlements may have been, or where individual archaeological sites may have been.
Okay, thank you. I think it definitely makes sense. I think it comes back to your point of, sort of all archaeology is somehow going to be maritime archaeology at some point. But I think that's quite exciting. I think it, allows at least students as well as researchers who are interested in the Stone Age to realize that, they don't get to avoid this, that, their future research may also just be underwater.
Yeah, I think I encourage everybody to try diving at least once. It's something that I love, and I miss the sea when I'm not near it. And I think that would be true for everybody.
Okay, any more questions? Okay.
Sorry, just one last thing. Thank you for calling me professor, but I'm not a professor, as much as I would like to be.
Okay.
So,
so that's okay. So I think there are no more questions, and it was lovely to have you, John. And it was an absolute pleasure to listen to maritime archaeology. I learned a lot from the presentation, and I'm hoping to look up more and hopefully also become somewhere deep down a maritime archaeologist. So that's, yep. Yeah, that's about it.
Well, thank you very much for having me. There are very few, there's 2 PhDs in Southern Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, in maritime archaeology, me and Elliot Moa from Namibia. We'd like to see many, many more. Please do it.
I will. Will I get to be the youngest woman as a maritime archaeologist?
You will. You will be the first PhD in Sub-Saharan Africa, for the first female PhD in Sub-Saharan Africa. So do it.
I'm gonna give it a serious thought at this point. Well, anyways, with that, I think we've come to the end of our session, and it was lovely to host you and have you for our series in the year 2022. Thank you so much for being a part of our series and talk. It was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Jatenda, I think we can stop recording.